Welcome to the Haunting Hour, where we bring your darkest fears to life through the chilling art of horror storytelling. If you're new here, don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss a new tale creeping into the shadows. Whether you're looking to unwind, embrace the thrill of fear, or lose yourself in a world where the line between the living and the dead blurs, this is the place for you. Now dim the lights, settle in, and prepare to be haunted by tonight's story. Halloween was the best night of the year for me and Max. We'd been best friends since forever, always planning our costumes and scouting the neighborhood for the houses with the best candy. But this year was going to be different. It all started about 2 weeks before Halloween, when the rumors at school hit like wildfire. Tombstone Valley. The older kids whispered about it like it was some legend. They talked about the candy first, houses that handed out full-sized candy bars, rare stuff you'd never find in our neighborhood. But they also spoke in hushed tones about something else. They wouldn't say exactly what, just hinted that it was a place no one dared to go. When someone mentioned it, they'd shiver, shrug, and say, "That's not a place you just find. It finds you." Max and I overheard them one day after school. "Have you heard of Tombstone Valley?" Max whispered, his eyes wide and alight with excitement. "Imagine if we actually found it. Full-sized candy bars, king-sized even." It was tempting, I won't lie. But every time someone brought it up, they'd end their story with a warning. Something like, "You don't go to Tombstone Valley without getting marked." What did that even mean? "Come on," Max prodded, grinning. "It's just a neighborhood. If we can find it, it's like guaranteed candy heaven." But the grown-ups were the strangest part of it all. When I casually brought it up to my mom, she froze, her face going pale. "Tombstone Valley isn't somewhere you go, Luke," she said. "Stay in the neighborhood this Halloween. I'm serious." Of course, she didn't explain why. Max and I couldn't shake the feeling we had to see it. Halloween was coming up fast, and as the night drew closer, we made our decision. We'd find Tombstone Valley, hit every house, and come back before anyone even noticed we were gone. And just like that, the plan was set. Halloween night was going to be unforgettable. But looking back now, I wish I'd listened to my mom's warning. I wish I'd stayed far, far away from that place. Halloween night arrived, and everything was perfect. The air was cool, with a thin fog creeping along the ground, making every yard and street feel just a little more mysterious. I stuffed my pillowcase into my pocket and strapped on my mask, an old-school skeleton mask with hollow eyes and a cracked grin. Max wore a vampire cape and plastic fangs that glinted in the streetlights. He looked ridiculous, but the excitement in his eyes was real. By the time most kids were heading home with their loot, Max and I stood at the far edge of our neighborhood, peering into the woods where we thought we'd find Tombstone Valley. We'd heard it was somewhere out here, hidden past the tree line. A place you could only find if you really wanted to. "Do you see anything?" I whispered, trying to ignore the nervous thumping of my heart. Max grinned. "Let's just go. We'll know it when we see it." The trees closed in around us, their branches stretching overhead like bony fingers. Every step we took felt heavy, like the darkness was pulling us in. I glanced back once, seeing the lights of our neighborhood far off in the distance. The glow seemed to fade the farther we went, and soon it was just us in the shadows. Then we found it. The trees parted, and we stepped into a clearing that led to a winding road. There, lined up in perfect rows, were the houses of Tombstone Valley. They didn't look abandoned, not at all. The lawns were perfectly trimmed, not a single leaf on the ground. Each house had a carved pumpkin on its doorstep, the kind you'd see in magazines. But these pumpkins had a weird look to them. Their grins were twisted, sharp, almost human. The lights inside them flickered strangely, casting eerie shadows on the steps. "Whoa," Max said, barely a whisper. "This place is amazing." I couldn't help but feel a chill creep up my spine. Something was off. I couldn't put my finger on it, but the silence felt heavy. There was no rustling of leaves, no distant voices, not even the hum of insects. Just an unsettling, dead silence. But then Max started walking toward the first house, and my nerves melted away, replaced by that Halloween excitement. After all, we'd made it. We were about to score the mother lode of candy. I shook off the strange feeling and followed him. At the first house, we knocked, and a woman answered almost immediately. She looked normal, sort of. Her smile was wide, maybe a little too wide, and her eyes seemed glassy, unfocused. But she handed us 2 full-sized candy bars, and we barely had time to say thank you before the door closed. As we walked to the next house, I laughed it off. "Maybe people here are just really into Halloween," I said. Max grinned. "Whatever. If they're giving us candy like this, I don't care if they're a little weird." House after house, we kept going, filling our pillowcases with candy that felt like gold. But each person we met had that same strange look. Wide smiles, blank eyes, and the longer we went, the colder the air got. Soon, I could see my breath puffing out in front of me. I looked up at the sky, but there wasn't a single cloud. Just a bright, cold moon casting a dim glow over the valley. The deeper into Tombstone Valley we went, the stranger things became. Shadows seemed to stretch longer, bending and twisting on the ground in ways that didn't match the trees or houses around us. Sometimes I'd look up and catch a neighbor watching us from their window, their face barely visible, but somehow unsettling, like they were studying us. But Max didn't seem to notice. His pillowcase was nearly full, and he was giddy with excitement. "We're going to be the legends of Halloween, Luke," he said, laughing. I tried to smile, but every instinct told me we should turn back. "Maybe we should go. I mean, we've got enough, right?" Max just rolled his eyes. "Come on, just one more block. There's got to be more houses." I wanted to argue, but something kept me silent. A strange, uneasy feeling grew in the pit of my stomach. But I couldn't leave Max. Not alone, not here. So I followed him deeper into Tombstone Valley, the chill seeping into my bones, each step feeling heavier than the last. And then just as we turned onto the last street, the wind picked up, carrying with it the faint sound of laughter. Not the fun, joyful kind, but something hollow, almost echoey. I glanced around, trying to find the source, but the street was empty. It was then I realized we were the only ones left. The street stretched out in front of us, silent and empty. I looked over at Max, expecting him to make some joke, but even he seemed spooked. His grin had faded, and his eyes darted around, searching the shadows. "What's wrong?" I asked, hoping for his usual laugh. His shrug. Anything to make me feel normal again. He shook his head, whispering, I thought I saw something." That was when we heard it. Music. Faint at first, like it was coming from a distance, but it grew louder with each second. A slow, haunting melody, carried by the wind. It sounded like it came from an old carnival, with a strange, offbeat rhythm that made my skin crawl. "Do you hear that?" I asked, my voice barely audible over the eerie tune. Max nodded, his face pale. "Yeah." "Where's it coming from?" Before I could answer, figures began to appear at the far end of the street. At first, it was just one or two, shadowy shapes moving toward us, but as they drew closer, the street lamps illuminated them. They were people, dressed in what looked like old-fashioned costumes, but not the kind you see on Halloween. These were elaborate, like something from a different time altogether. Their faces were painted with intricate designs, some of them resembling skulls, with wide painted smiles that stretched across their cheeks. The music grew louder, and the figures began to move in sync, almost as if they were dancing. I felt frozen, my feet rooted to the ground, and my heart pounded in my chest. There was something wrong with the way they moved, too slow and precise, like each step was carefully controlled. "Let's go," I whispered, grabbing Max's arm, but he didn't move. His eyes were wide, locked on the figures coming toward us. "Max, come on!" I hissed, trying to pull him away, but he just stood there, transfixed. The procession was getting closer now. The first figure in the line, a tall man with a painted skeleton face, turned his head toward us, his dark eyes meeting mine. His lips stretched into an unnatural grin, showing sharp, gleaming teeth. He didn't look away, he just kept staring, his gaze intense and unblinking. One by one, the others turned their heads as well, each face painted with the same eerie grin, each pair of eyes cold and empty. I felt a chill run down my spine. They were watching us, not like you'd look at other trick-or-treaters or passers-by. No, this was different. Their eyes had a look of hunger. Max finally snapped out of it, stumbling back as if he'd just woken from a dream. What are they doing?" The figures moved in perfect silence now, their footsteps in unison, and the music shifted, growing faster, more chaotic, like the beat of a war drum. They weren't just watching us. They were surrounding us, closing the distance step by step. "Run!" I whispered, my voice barely a breath. But Max heard it. We both turned and bolted down the street, away from the procession, our footsteps loud in the dead silence. But as we ran, the laughter returned, louder now, echoing off the houses. I glanced back, my heart skipping a beat when I saw that the procession was still following us. They weren't running, but their steps seemed to match our speed, gliding closer without breaking pace, their painted faces grinning in the dim light. We turned a corner, stumbling onto another street, but the scene in front of us made me freeze in my tracks. The houses looked different, twisted somehow. The pumpkins on the steps seemed to watch us, their eyes too lifelike, their grins too wide, like they were mocking us. "Where are we?" Max panted, looking around in panic. "This isn't the way we came." I didn't know what to say. It felt like the streets had rearranged themselves, leading us deeper into the valley, trapping us in a maze of identical houses and leering pumpkins. The laughter grew louder, and I felt a shiver run through me. Then, from the shadows of a nearby porch, I saw movement. A small figure stepped forward. A child, maybe a little older than us, dressed in a clown costume. But his face wasn't painted. No, it was pale, almost ghostly, with wide eyes that stared at me, unblinking. He raised a hand and pointed, his expression blank. Slowly, I followed his gaze, my eyes landing on a house at the end of the street. It was different from the others, larger, darker, with windows that seemed to stare back at me. I felt a strange pull, like the house was calling to me, daring me to come closer. "Luke, we need to go," Max said, his voice trembling. But I couldn't look away from the house. It was as if something in there was waiting for us. Some part of me wanted to turn and run, to leave Tombstone Valley and never look back. But another part of me, the part that had insisted we come here in the first place, wanted to know what was inside. "Just one more stop," I said, barely recognizing my own voice. Max looked at me like I was crazy, but he nodded. Together we walked toward the house, each step feeling heavier, the weight of unseen eyes pressing down on us. The laughter faded, replaced by an eerie silence, as if the entire valley was holding its breath. When we reached the door, I hesitated, glancing back at Max. He nodded, swallowing hard, and I raised my hand to knock. But before I could, the door creaked open on its own, revealing a dark hallway that seemed to stretch endlessly into shadow. "Hello?" I called, my voice small in the silence. No answer. I looked back one last time, hoping to see the familiar street, the way out. But all I saw were those painted faces, watching us, grinning, their eyes gleaming in the darkness. They weren't going anywhere. I took a deep breath and stepped inside. The air inside the house was thick, stale, and cold. Shadows seemed to cling to the walls, stretching toward us like they had a life of their own. The door clicked shut behind us, the sound echoing through the empty rooms, and suddenly I felt trapped. "Luke," Max whispered, his voice trembling. "I don't think we should be here." I wanted to agree, to turn around and leave, but something held me in place. The hallway stretched before us, lined with faded wallpaper and dim lights that barely illuminated the path. Each step we took made the floorboards creak, the sound eerily loud in the silent house. At the end of the hall, we reached a large room that looked like a dining room, frozen in time. A long table sat in the center, covered in a thick layer of dust. Plates and silverware were set perfectly, as if waiting for a meal that had never come. I reached out, brushing my fingers over a fork, and a shiver ran through me. The metal was ice cold, and I could feel something dark and heavy in the air, like a memory lingering just out of reach. "Let's get out of here," Max said, tugging at my sleeve. But as we turned to leave, I noticed a portrait hanging on the wall. It was of a family, a mother, father, and 2 kids. The painting was old, the colors faded, but their faces were unmistakable. Each one had that same unnatural grin, painted too wide, too sharp, their eyes staring directly out of the frame. I felt their gaze follow us, watching our every move. Their smiles were cold, empty, like they were posing for a portrait in a dream, or a nightmare. Max tugged at my arm again, more urgently this time, and I could see the fear in his eyes. "Luke, come on, please." I nodded, turning to leave. But as we stepped back into the hallway, the lights flickered, casting strange shadows that seemed to move on their own. I glanced back at the portrait one last time, and froze. The family in the painting. They had changed. Their heads were tilted, their eyes narrow and dark, watching us with a hunger that made my skin crawl. We bolted down the hallway, our footsteps loud against the creaking floorboards, and stumbled into another room, a living room filled with old furniture covered in dust. The walls were lined with more portraits, each one more unsettling than the last. Children in old-fashioned clothes with empty eyes, men and women with twisted smiles, all staring down at us. "This isn't right," Max whispered, his face pale. "These people, they're watching us." I didn't want to believe it, but I felt it too. The eyes in the portraits seemed to follow us, shifting as we moved, their expressions changing, darkening. I couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't just paintings. It was like the people in the portraits were trapped, frozen in time, unable to escape. We edged toward the doorway, my heart pounding so loud I could barely hear anything else. But just as we reached it, we heard a faint sound, a scratching noise coming from the walls. "Did you hear that?" I whispered, glancing at Max. He nodded, his eyes wide. "Let's just go." We turned, hurrying toward the exit, but the hallway seemed longer now, stretching into darkness. Every step felt like we were moving deeper into the house, instead of closer to the door. The scratching grew louder, joined by whispers, faint and muffled, like voices trapped behind the walls. Suddenly we reached a staircase leading downward, its steps old and worn. A chill ran down my spine, but there was no turning back now. I glanced at Max, who looked as terrified as I felt, but he nodded. And together, we descended the stairs, each step feeling like it was pulling us deeper into something dark and ancient. At the bottom of the stairs, we found ourselves in a basement dimly lit by a single flickering light bulb hanging from the ceiling. The room was filled with old toys, dusty furniture, and cracked mirrors that reflected distorted versions of ourselves. And at the far end of the basement, there was a door, heavy, wooden, and slightly ajar. My heart hammered in my chest as we stepped toward it. I could feel the air growing colder, thicker, like something was waiting for us just beyond that door. The whispers were louder now, surrounding us, filling the room with a strange rhythmic chanting that made my skin crawl. We pushed the door open, stepping into a small dark room. And there, in the center, was a chair. It looked ancient, the wood worn and splintered. And seated in it was a figure, a boy about our age, with pale skin and hollow eyes. He was staring straight ahead, unmoving, his expression blank. He looked familiar. It hit me suddenly. This was the boy we'd seen earlier, the one in the clown costume. But now, his face was different, drained of life, his eyes empty and cold. I wanted to scream, to turn and run, but my legs wouldn't move. And then, slowly, his head turned, his gaze shifting to meet ours. His mouth stretched into a wide, twisted grin, and he whispered, "You shouldn't be here." I stumbled back, grabbing Max's arm, my mind racing. We had to get out. We had to escape. But as we turned, the basement door slammed shut, and the whispers rose to a fever pitch, echoing through the room. The portraits, the scratching, the boy. It all clicked. This wasn't just some haunted house. Tombstone Valley wasn't a place you visited and left. It was a trap. A place that pulled you in, holding you, feeding off your fear. "Run!" I screamed, my voice shaking, and Max and I bolted up the stairs, slamming into the door, pounding on it until it burst open. We stumbled into the hallway, the house seeming to twist and shift around us. Shadows closed in. The walls seemed to pulse, and I could feel the whole house coming alive, trying to keep us here. As we reached the front door, I glanced back and saw the figures from the portraits now standing in the hallway. Their smiles stretched, their eyes dark and empty, watching us. We tore through the door and into the night, our only thought to get as far away from that house as possible. But as we ran down the street, I realized we weren't alone. The shadows followed us, figures slipping from the darkness, painted faces grinning as they moved closer, surrounding us. It was then that I realized the truth. Tombstone Valley didn't want visitors. It wanted us to stay. We bolted out of the house, our feet slamming against the pavement as we sprinted down the street. My heart pounded so hard, I could feel it in my throat, my breath coming fast and shallow. I didn't dare look back, but I knew they were behind us. I could feel their eyes on me, cold and hungry. "Max, keep going," I shouted, but when I glanced to my side, Max wasn't there. I skidded to a stop, my eyes darting through the shadows, searching for him. He was gone. Panic clawed at me, a deep, primal fear that made my hands shake. I was alone. "Max," I called, my voice a shaky whisper, swallowed by the silence. But there was no answer, only the faint, echoing laughter that drifted through the valley, growing louder, closer. I had to move. I couldn't stay here, waiting to get caught. I turned and ran, the shadows twisting and shifting around me, like the whole valley was alive, bending to keep me in. Every house I passed seemed darker, the pumpkins on the porches watching me, with wide, knowing eyes. I could almost feel their twisted grins, mocking me, waiting for me to trip, to slow down. Anything that would make their chase easier. The laughter grew louder, an eerie echo that seemed to come from everywhere at once. And then I heard the footsteps. They started slow, a soft patter against the ground, but soon they grew louder, faster, like a stampede. I ran faster, my legs burning, every part of me screaming to escape. The houses blurred past me, twisted and wrong, like they were stretching toward me, their windows dark and hollow. The streetlights flickered, casting strange, shifting shadows that seemed to reach for me as I passed. "Just keep running," I told myself, my breath coming in ragged gasps. "Just don't look back." But I could hear them, closer now. The figures with painted faces, those empty, grinning eyes. Everywhere I looked, they seemed to be waiting for me, watching from the shadows. And then, as I rounded a corner, I nearly stumbled. In front of me, lining the street, were more of them. Figures from the parade, their skull-painted faces grinning as they stepped out, closing off the path ahead. "Please. Please," I whispered, panic choking my voice. I turned, hoping to find another way, but more figures blocked the street behind me, their eyes gleaming in the dark, their smiles stretching wider. Trapped. I was trapped. They moved closer, their footsteps slow and rhythmic, like they were savoring every second of my fear. I backed away, my heart pounding so hard I thought it would burst. The laughter rose, filling the air, surrounding me, a cacophony of hollow, mocking voices. "No! No!" I screamed, my voice shaking. I turned and sprinted down a side alley, praying it would lead somewhere, anywhere that wasn't here. The alley twisted, turning sharply, and suddenly I found myself in front of a high, rusty gate. My heart sank. The gate was tall, its iron bars twisted and dark, and there was no way I could climb it. But then, through the bars, I saw it. The trees, the open road, the faint glow of streetlights. The way out. Freedom was right there, just on the other side. I gripped the bars, pulling, but they didn't budge. Panic surged through me as I threw my weight against them. Desperate, frantic. But the gate held firm. And then, I felt a hand on my shoulder. I whipped around, and there they were, the painted faces, their grins wide and unnatural, their eyes empty. They surrounded me, closing in, their footsteps slow and deliberate. Each one held out a hand, reaching for me, fingers pale and bony, their faces frozen in twisted, mocking grins. "Stay," one of them whispered, their voice low and hollow, barely more than a breath. "You belong here now." "No!" I screamed, fighting against the hands that reached for me, clawing at them, pushing them away. But there were too many. They closed in, their laughter filling my ears, their faces twisted into grotesque smiles. I felt their hands gripping my arms, my shoulders, cold and unyielding, pulling me back. I tried to fight, but my strength was fading, the cold seeping into my bones, weighing me down. The laughter surrounded me, growing louder, echoing through the valley, a sound that would haunt me forever. In one last, desperate effort, I pulled away, breaking free of their grasp. I stumbled backward, barely able to stand, my vision blurring as I looked around, searching for a way out. Then, in the distance, I saw him. Max, standing at the edge of the alley, his face pale, his eyes wide with terror. "Max!" I cried, reaching for him. But he didn't move. He just stood there, staring, his face expressionless, his mouth slightly open. And then slowly, he raised his hand, pointing back down the alley. I followed his gaze, my heart sinking as I saw what he was pointing at. It was me, a figure that looked just like me, standing in the shadows, grinning, its eyes dark and empty. "No," I whispered, stumbling back. The figure took a step forward, then another, moving closer, its face twisted into a wide, unnatural grin. I tried to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The laughter grew louder, surrounding me, filling my head, drowning out every other sound. And then everything went black. I don't remember how I got out. When I opened my eyes, I was lying on my front porch, the first rays of dawn creeping over the horizon. My pillowcase of candy lay beside me, untouched. My head ached, my whole body felt heavy, and for a moment, I thought it had all been a dream. But then, I looked down and saw it. Paint smudged across my hand, dark and faint, like the remains of a twisted smile. I scrubbed at it, but it wouldn't come off. I never saw Max again. The police searched for him, my parents asked questions, but no one found anything. Tombstone Valley was never mentioned again. The older kids stopped talking about it. No one else seemed to remember it existed at all. But I remember. I remember the laughter, the twisted faces, the cold, unblinking eyes. And every Halloween, I can still feel it. The weight of their gaze, watching, waiting, calling me back. No matter where I go, I know they're still there, waiting for me in the shadows of Tombstone Valley. And I know that one day, I'll have to go back.